Our Constitution is noted for its brevity, especially compared to more modern versions. So when we talk about sign regulation, what part of that are we concerned about?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, right. And freedom of speech, last year, that's how we refer to it. It's Congress passed no laws that will infringe upon the right to speak. Paraphrase. And this is not, of course, speech. Technically, it's signage. But we understand that the rights that are protected here are communication. And it's communication and the right to communicate that's being protected here. And so you might say, oh well, yeah, but it's not speech because they're not speaking it, but they're words, right? But it's not just words either. It's expression. It's the freedom to express, to communicate, to articulate opinion, and to communicate an idea. And of course, being in variously in the College of Architecture and Planning, we know that communication is much more than words, and we're required as professionals regularly to avail ourselves of non-verbal ways of communication. And the First Amendment speaks to all of those forms of expression. Okay, so we engage in communication for a number of different objectives here, and what we have in the Metro Media versus San Diego case is a couple of examples of different styles of communication, forms of communication, but most importantly, motivations for communication. And what we learned from this case is that the First Amendment, the freedom of expression, freedom of speech clause in the First Amendment doesn't protect all forms of expression or all expressions. It is not unlimited, but it is pretty darn broad. And if we were to go through and kind of characterize the breadth of each one of the clauses and rights and civil liberties that are protected in the entire Bill of Rights, the entire first 10 amendments, this one would probably, if you were to represent it graphically, this would have the biggest circle on the Venn diagram, probably. It's right up there. I mean, it really is at the heart, and we understand it as being at the heart of a democratic society, because it is that ability to communicate and share ideas, which is really the soil that nourishes the continuation of our form of democratic government. And without this, democracy has very little chance of continuing. And so it is perhaps our most cherished of the civil liberties that we care to guard. That being said, how many people love billboards? Not very many. It's amazing how uniformly, nearly uniformly, how broadly they are despised, and yet how valuable they are in terms of economic activity, which is also explains why they are so amazingly well protected in our political system. When you look at the entirety of the Land Use Development and Management Act of the state of Utah, and you go through page by page by page by page and classify all the different subject matter that are addressed in the bill, by far, the one subject matter area that is covered the most, billboards. And specifically, the limitation or limitations placed on local government in their ability to regulate billboards. And you may say, well, the legislature is just looking after our First Amendment rights. Yeah, partly. But they're also responding to the billboard lobby, which is, in terms of its influence, enormous. And you would say, how is it that an industry that seems to be so widely despised has so much influence? Money, yeah. They are highly sought after, and you know that those spaces that are being occupied by all sorts of things from, oh gosh, I mean, I saw one just the other day advertising colonoscopies. I thought, really? Really? And it was well designed, you know. It had this calligraphy style, this font style that was popular, about 50 years ago. And so it was clever, because people of my generation, or people who generally should be consuming, shall we say, these kinds of services, we would resonate with that kind of graphic display. Kind of strange. The first time I came to Utah, I was driving here from Portland, and I had driven through before years ago on Interstate 80, but I was really coming here. I was coming actually to buy a house in preparation to move here about 15 years ago, about this time of the year. And I was driving in on Interstate 84, and it took my breath. It was just so beautiful. Coming in, I mean, if you've done this, you've driven in from the northwest on 84, and you start getting close, you start, coming around the edge of the lake there, and you start coming in, and you get your first glimpse of the Wasatch Front. And it's just, in this time of the year especially, the sky's so blue, and there's still snow on the top, and there's green down below. It's just, oh my gosh.
You just have to compare it to what you just came from. So that's why it's so.
Well, yeah, gray and rainy. And I think I'll move here. And then I got a little bit closer, and then there were these huge billboards. And from about Brigham, starting at about Brigham on the way towards Ogden, they just start to dominate the viewshed to such a great extent. It is so achingly gorgeous here. And look what they're doing with it. What's wrong with these people? So I decided I had to come here to see them. So with that as a more or less poetic introduction, I have various candidates around the room that I'm looking to, and their names are Craig and Sean and Spencer and Brian and Taylor. I'm wondering, and Ed, he looked away. So I'm wondering amongst you, who would like to talk to us about Metro Media? Hey, Ryan. Metro Media versus San Diego.
Okay, so
Don't worry, if you do, we'll get it right.
yeah, San Diego City they passed an ordinance that prohibited outdoor advertising within the city limits. And they passed an ordinance based off of the theory to eliminate hazards to pedestrians and motorists brought about by distracting displays and preserve and improve the appearance of the city. So they passed the ordinance that the ordinance actually did permit on-site commercial advertising. So if you own that piece of property and the goods or service could be purchased on that piece of property, you could have a sign on your property or a billboard. Metro Media, or the outdoor advertising companies, they brought suit to the state court and claimed that the ordinance was basically unconstitutional and overreached on their First Amendment rights. So the signs that were permitted, interesting enough, that the the one I saw is temporary political campaign signs somehow may be permitted sign list. And,
That's another reason why there's so much of movement is restricting
Yeah.
local government's ability to regulate.
your
Billboards.
government signs,
That's just
signs
consumable.
located at bus stops were permitted, signs within a shopping mall, commemorative historical plaques, signs that showed time, weather, were permitted. So basically, the result of the case was well, the trial court found the ordinance to be constitutional, and in intermediate court, the appellate court affirmed that. But then it went to the California Supreme Court and they reversed, saying that that did impose the overreach in the first amendment. There was a test that was applied in another court case called Central Hudson Gas Electric Court.
Right.
This versus Public Service Commission. It's a 4-part test. You want me to go through what
Sure, you bet.
the
The Central Hudson test is still the most widely applied rubric for understanding the limit of government ability to regulate.
Okay, so here's the parts of the test. The first part of the test stated that that speech is protected if there is a lawful activity and not misleading.
So can't be lawful.
Must be lawful.
Must be lawful. And not misleading with those double negatives.
Second, the government must seek to implement a substantial governmental interest.
Mm-hmm.
Third, the regulation must promote that interest. And the fourth is the regulation must be narrowly tailored, whatever that means.
Not overly broad.
Yeah. And I think the biggest issue I think in this court case was that there came up saying, "Hey, I have a billboard," and you say you can't use it as a commercial, but I can put a non-commercial message up, and is that illegal or not? I think that's where
To what part of the ordinance did this apply? Because basically the ordinance regulated, it had basically 3 different parts, and you've already outlined, which was commercial, off-site commercial speech. Oops, no, that's right. Off-site, not allowed at all. Right? Yeah. On-site commercial, generally allowed, right? And then, I guess, on-site, non-commercial speech, partially allowed, right? So does Central Hudson apply to all 3 of these? No. What does it apply to, at least according to the plurality?
Interest.
Yeah, to commercials. Okay. To 1 and 2. We end up with a different test for number 3, don't we? And it kind of got buried in there. Did you catch it?
Is that where, this is where I kind of got unclear on me, is the time, place, and manner.
Exactly. Exactly. They don't spell it out abundantly clear. They're not abundantly clear in what they spell it out. But what they are saying is basically we've got two different standards in interpreting the restrictions in the First Amendment that restrict government's ability to limit speech. And we are more lenient about government's ability to limit notes, restricting limitations. There's double, triple negatives, all very, this whole discussion I apologize for, but it's what it is. We are more lenient. In other words, the Constitution allows a freer hand for government to regulate commercial speech than to regulate non-commercial speech. And the policy is why? Why do you suppose that's true? Why don't we just have the same standard for all speech?
My opinion is, one is, there's alternative motives in basically in money for business.
I think the founding fathers were probably most concerned about protecting us from government. And so the free speech is to say, hey, government, I think you guys are wacko, stop it, knock it off, I don't like you. And that's the speech they were most important, that they were most concerned with protecting. So that's why it's non-commercial is the most.
Yeah, the sense is that non-commercial speech is most closely aligned with this sense that I spoke of before of the association with democracy. Because it's the non-commercial speech generally. Political speech is what it is. Not always, but most often. There were signs, maybe some of you, maybe one of you is responsible for these. There's signs that are showing up around the college today that one of them said, if I had known how important this was to my horse, I would have paid more attention during my first year of college, or something to that effect. And it was put up on the bulletin board. That's all it said. But, yeah, I like that. I like that. I don't think it's political speech. I would say it's more kind of thoughtful, artistic speech. But
Because of Oklahoma passing a law to kill the horses for meat, is that why they're doing it?
oh, maybe I hadn't thought about that. So it was political speech. I had no idea. But this is the category in which political speech falls. And so because of the importance of having a free, as we call a free marketplace of ideas in this country, and the centrality of that to the maintenance of democratic institutions, we are very, very careful about protecting, especially this type of speech. This type of speech is not motivated by the same general incentive, right? I mean, this one is incentivized by business, commerce, right? And not necessarily. Although sometimes there's overlap. I'm not saying they're always separate. Okay, so the time, place, manner, and this is what it's called. What we're talking about is the standard that we apply in assessing regulations that attempt to limit non-commercial speech. And so Central Hudson is really our commercial speech test. And meaning that we are analyzing government regulations that limit commercial speech using these four factors to determine whether those limitations meet constitutional standards, meet the requirements of the First For non-commercial speech, we have a set of standards that go by, this is just a name, time, place, manner. Because they are generally regulating the time, place, and manner of speech. And that's about all you can do. Right? So, what are the standards for this category, Ryan? Can you regulate the content?
No. No.
No. So content neutrality is the first element. Oops, there's an R there. The last thing you want is the government saying, regulating what you can put into the content of speech. Someone else here? Anybody? Yeah.
I have a question on that first one.
Sure.
Since broadcasting and things like that, they have certain regulations on what words can be said, profanity wise. What if somebody was angry with the government, so they made a political ad that has all these profanities in them? How does that line up with that?
Yeah, and you watch Jon Stewart, man, every other beep, beep, beep. It's really hard to get the kind of flow of what he's trying to say. George Carlin explored the boundaries of this issue. The 7 words you can't say on television, and he got arrested for it. And it's the 1960s. There's a movie I saw recently about Allen Ginsberg, and about his first famous book of poetry called Power. That's the name of the movie. And it's about the obscenity trial, because he was arrested for obscenity and for publishing. Actually, it was publishing. Arrested for publishing this book. City Light Books, which is a bookstore that also got involved in publishing in San Francisco. Still there on Columbus Street in San Francisco. Venerated institution. And it's fascinating because we don't get these kinds of trials anymore. Obscenity is generally not prosecuted the way it was in the 1950s, the 1960s. And so, it's quaint to think about George Carlin. So why is it that we have, anybody know the answer? Why is it that we have those standards? First of all, the most basic answer is that the standards are voluntary. The broadcasters have Association of Broadcasters, National Association of Broadcasters, and maybe have a set of standards that are voluntary, to which all the major broadcasting outlets have agreed to. So it's not regulated, but it's self-regulated. Why do you think they did that?
Because it's much better to come up with your own rules and have rules enforced on you.
Yes, there was the threat in the 1950s that Congress was going to pass legislation developing these rules, or empower the Federal Communications Commission to develop these rules. And they said, no, we'll self-regulate, so don't do that. But if Congress were to essentially codify those rules, at least this part of those rules would still probably pass muster what?
Safety welfare. Kind of going on the morals kind of thing?
Yeah, kind of. It's related. Here's our first limitation. I mean, look over here. This basically requires that the speech not be unlawful or not be misleading, right? Well, why can't I advertise my cocaine distribution business? I've got my First Amendment rights, right? I'm in business. It's an illegal business, but so what? I still have. Does that mean I don't have First Amendment rights? Yes.
Yes.
Is the answer. The First Amendment does not extend and does not protect speech which is unlawful or the basis of fraud. It's misleading. So, untruthful speech. Governor Herbert wears yellow underwear. I'm going to put it up in a big billboard. Maybe he does, I don't know. But anything that's misleading, untruthful, unlawful, and this wasn't mentioned in Central Hudson, but also obscene. Obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. What's obscenity? What's obscene?
That's hard to decide.
I can't tell you, but I know when I see it.
There you go. Thank you very much. And who said that? I think it was Justice.
I just did right there. But
Yes. I believe it was Justice Stevens, or maybe it was Potter Stewart, but one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices. This is from mid-1960s. It's basically, it can be a community-based assessment of expression that is prurient or is strictly sexually oriented with no redeeming cultural value. Now, can you figure it out? No. No, this is very difficult, and the communities that had to wrestle with this, especially in court when it's being challenged, have generally come to the conclusion that it's almost impossible to figure out what it is. I mean, at the extremes, I think you can probably get some sort of community buy-in on certain things that are obscene, but it's very, very difficult. But for our understanding, for our purposes, we can add this. To the list. Okay. So back to our non-commercial speech. There was a hand up there somewhere out in the seat. No? No? Okay. Kevin, now there is.
She said it can't be not truthful or misleading.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is another thing that is, it kind of pushes the boundaries. The political about advertising is criticized for not being completely honest. Stop confusing us with the real world.
It's a political commercial then? It's not commercial, so it doesn't fall into that.
No, so there you go. See, that's how you get around it. It's not commercial speech. Good answer. I once saw a great New Yorker cartoon. There were these old professors hanging around the faculty lounge in a much more auspicious university than this one, obviously, because they haven't seen our faculty. This did not look like our faculty lounge. It looks like a faculty lounge in some Ivy League school. Leather patches and others. And one guy was pointing the stem of his pipe into the chest of this person next to him and says, "Okay, I agree with you that it works in practice. Can you prove to me that it works in theory?" So where are we on this thing? Okay, on page 563, this is where the standings. We have observed that time, place, and manner restrictions are permissible if they're justified without reference to the content of the regulated speech, in other words, they're content neutral, serve a significant government interest, and provide for an alternative forum for those views to be expressed. So what's being regulated is not the content, what's being regulated is the time, the place, and the manner of speech. In order for that regulation to be justified, there has to be a significant government, it has to be promoting or serving some significant governmental interest. And there has to be some a reasonably equivalent alternative channels for communication of that same information or point of view. So, when our national political parties have their conventions, their nominating conventions every 4 years for the presidential election, they tend to attract a whole bunch of people who are interested in this kind of speech, right? And especially ever since 1968, when we had riots in Chicago, and I was living in Chicago, I was 8 years old, and I remember the riots in Grant Park that accompanied the Democratic National Convention that year. There have been pretty strict guidelines that the parties have used in conjunction and worked out ahead of time with the cities that host the conventions. And they almost always include restricting the area immediately surrounding the convention site. And so almost uniformly, of course it varies from year to year and city to city, and it's not always the same, but if you look at, especially since 1968, every one of those conventions is marked by this management of dissent, because the people who are coming to express their non-commercial speech, their political views are generally not happy with the status quo and are wishing to express that displeasure. And they can tend to be rather vocal, and as we saw in 1968, they can actually get a little violent sometimes. And so, in order to balance the government's legitimate interest in maintaining order, positive welfare, with the people's right to express themselves, what has been worked out in every one of these situations is a situation where the zone, it's temporary zoning. The area around the convention site is usually blocked off and only accessible by people with credentials. And there is some other free speech zone, it's referred to, that is a block or two, half a mile away from the convention site. And that's where the people with posters, placards go. Every time this happens, the ACLU is monitoring the situation and frequently running to court to try to get injunctions to change the system because they are reasonably upset or concerned about the ability of people with potentially unpopular points of view being able to have some level of access to the convention delegates. And that's reasonable. But that's what this alternative form is all about. It would not be constitutional just to say you cannot protest at the National Convention. Okay, so make it a little bit closer to home. Every time there is a general conference, LDS Church has a general conference here in Salt Lake City. Some years there are more protesters than others, but there are pretty clear regulations that the city has implemented to allow people to express whatever opinion it is that they want to express without interfering with the comings and goings of people who are going to the conference. And so, there's usually an area that's designated where people can, protest and have signs and so forth. And that's also attempting to follow these standards. And so, the time and place and manner of those protests is regulated, but the protests are allowed, and they are. It's a balancing act. There's a significant governmental interest in maintaining order and in ensuring the kind of freedom of people who are participating in the event, whether it's a national political convention or a general conference, to be able to come and go unharassed and unmolested. And that is a legitimate governmental interest. No one is regulating what they say or what they do. They just said, you do it at this time, in this place, in this manner. So how does the San Diego ordinance hold up against these standards?
So the California Supreme Court reversed it, I think based off of, it was based off of, but they couldn't, there wasn't enough balance, I think, between the two, where they couldn't say, all commercial, has to go away, or is prohibited. Is that right? Is that what they
Well,
want?
yeah, let's not focus on the California court's decision. Let's focus on this one. This is the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court, like I said, it's clear as it might have been about the application of these two tests. But when you march through the logic of the opinion, you can see that the court is, in a way, addressing these two first, and then going on to this one next. And again, Central Hudson is applying to these two parts of the ordinance, and this time, place, manner set of standards is applying to the non-commercial speech. What happens at the end of the day? Does the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, uphold the ordinance or knock it down? No. You would think that. You're kind of rolling along. That's the way these things go. You're reading along and say, oh yeah, okay, I can see the court's going this way, and it's like, because it goes through the Central Hudson analysis, looking at the commercial, the regulations on commercial speech, those portions of the ordinance, say, oh yeah, the court seems to be going along with this, seems like it's good. And then all of a sudden, they change direction when they start talking about the regulation of non-commercial speech. And it's like, oh, this train's coming off the track. Yeah, they invalidate the ordinance. In other words, they affirm the California Supreme Court's invalidation. And it was based on this portion of the ordinance. As far as the regulation of commercial speech, the court was willing to go along with this. Now, if you read the concurring opinion, by two of the justices, you find that at least those concurring justices weren't sure that the ordinance even meant this part. They weren't sure that, especially step number 3 was complied with here. Let's talk about this a little bit here, because this is kind of similar, and someone over here, maybe Ms. Cobb, talked about health, safety, and welfare, or police power authority. There's some similarities here, and by this point in the semester, you're starting to see kind of the same words kind of coming back in different guises and different places. So, okay, we know this first criterion here is kind of a preamble. We're just stating so everybody is clear on this, that the First Amendment does not protect unlawful, misleading, or obscene speech. Okay. The other speech that's not unlawful, not misleading, not obscene, can be regulated if it's commercial speech if there is a substantial governmental interest. In other words, if there is some sort of substantial governmental interest that is attempting to be achieved or promoted or protected here. And in this case, traffic safety and aesthetics. And then this third item here is kind of asking whether the means to achieve it are actually doing it. Right? So first, tell us what your interest is. Tell us why you're trying to regulate speech. What's your aim here? Traffic safety and aesthetics. Okay, now show us that your regulation actually promotes those interests, actually achieves the end that you set out for yourself. So it's a kind of a means-ends thing, right? So in a way, it kind of sounds like substantive due process, right? Because the test for substantive due process is that the regulation or the governmental action has to effectively promote or protect the community's health, safety, and welfare. And if you remember back to the Hawaii case, Lingo versus Chevron, the gas station case, the court said, protecting consumers from gouging, overly inflated prices, that's a legitimate governmental purpose, you bet. But the means that you've chosen to try to achieve that don't have anything to do with that outcome. They are not effective in achieving that purpose. So this means ends kind of articulation of analysis shows up in many guises. This is just the First Amendment's version of it. And this is where the concurring justices thought, you know what, you guys didn't really do your homework, city of San Diego. You just say, you assert without proof that, you proof by assertion, you just say, well, we're trying to protect aesthetics and promote traffic safety. And the plurality opinion here, which is, by the way, not a majority, because there wasn't a majority in this case, but the opinion that got the most votes, the most number of justices signing that on the bottom, says, well, we kind of all know this instinctively. We don't really need proof. And, everybody knows that, like I was saying at the beginning of class, everybody knows that billboards are butt ugly, so, aesthetic stuff just proves itself. And as far as traffic, concerns, well, that makes logical sense. Okay, so we're going to go with it. And the concurring justices say, wait a minute, we're talking about speech here. We're talking about the First Amendment. You guys need to prove up a little.
You mentioned plurality, so if 2 or 3 judges say we don't vote, you don't say like.
Yeah, so how does that work? I knew this was going to come up. Yeah. Usually what happens in the Supreme Court is you get you get 5 or more justices signing on to a single opinion. And then it's the majority opinion. And that is the law of the case. Sometimes you get little clusters. Sometimes it's not dichotomous. Sometimes it's not just there's a majority and then there maybe is a minority. Right? Sometimes you get these little groupings, and you get 2 or 3 that want this outcome with this rationale, and 2 or 3 that want this outcome with this rationale, and 2 or 3 that want this outcome with this rationale. And what they'll do is they will look to see if the outcomes match, and they'll take. So you get 2 or 3 here that want a dismissal, and 2 or 3 for this reason, and 2 or 3 here that want dismissal for a completely different reason. And they'll say, okay, you put them together. That's 5 or more votes for the particular outcome. And that's how the case resolves. And the lead opinion called the plurality opinion, is the one that has the most signers, signatories, justices signing on to that opinion. And so the lead opinion here is that plurality opinion. Now, in terms of its precedential value, it's weak. And technically speaking, the only thing that the case stands for is the outcome. Because that was the only thing that you got the majority of the court to vote on. And so technically speaking, this plurality opinion is not binding law, but it's repeated so often, it has persuasive authority. And so it effectively has become the standard. The Metro Media case is the number one leading case on sign regulation in the country. And so this formulation that we're working through here is de facto the rule of law. Yeah. Okay.
So since you mentioned that San Diego didn't really do their homework, would this have changed if you would have provided a well-researched report that shows, hey, for X amount of square footage on a freeway, there's an increase of fatalities?
Yeah. And there are studies that do that, and this is one of the reasons why San Diego's able to kind of skate through here, at least with the plurality justices, is that there have been a lot of studies that have looked at the effect of outdoor advertising on decreasing distraction, driving distraction, and then the subsequent effect that driving distraction has on safety and crash rates. And so there is a fair amount of research on that. I think these concurring justices just wanted to see, okay, do it again. Do another study, do it for San Diego. And I think they also are concerned about this being overly broad because they said, well, you know, does having a billboard in an industrial neighborhood next to oil refineries have the same impact on these public values as having a billboard next to a public park? And certainly on the aesthetics issue, one can make a reasonable argument that, you know what, refineries are quite ugly too. And maybe that's, we'll just put all our ugly stuff all together, all in one place. That's where the sexually oriented businesses go too, by the way. And so we'll just put all that stuff over there. And but this ordinance is with single brush regulating commercial speech pretty significantly. And I think that was another problem with comparing justices. Okay. So do we understand this metric? Okay, we get another brush at it in the next case. In Melrose versus Pittsburgh. More recent case. I was so excited. Oh, 2010, cool. Spencer? Comments? Yes?
No, I didn't know.
What's that?
Talked on the CC.
You did? Okay. I'll take your word. Ed?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Fumble for this one.
That's all right, I did too. Let's fumble together. Okay, so what's place us in the context here?
Okay, so in the city of Pittsburgh, Melrose Chief goes and they get agreements to put signage on 5 buildings. First they put pretty standard signage using names of relatives and different people. Then they decide that they want to change their names to basically .coms. WeHireNurses.com and another one that they use, PALegalHealth.com.
And it sounds like Energy Solutions Arena. Or where is it that the Cleveland Cavaliers play at? They play at QuickenLoans.com. So exactly like this. By the way, did you notice that those older names, the ones done in the 1990s, one of them was Caskey Limited named after the girlfriend of one of the Melrose officers. Really?
I know, it's,
How did you think she felt about that? Limited? How so, honey? Let's talk about that limited part. So anyway, I was wondering how that conversation, that maybe that's why they're changing the name.
Maybe she likes it.
Maybe, I don't know. Okay, so yes, and the city denies, right, the applications, based on what reason?
Well, they take issue because they have pretty strict signage regulations, and this isn't an area where there's no advertising signs allowed. And so they have three different types of signage: advertising signs, business sign, and identification signs. And they classify basically what Melrose is doing as an advertising sign. They say it's trying to go around that regulation by putting on a building as an identification sign.
Because these, excuse me, in these particular zones, those are the only kinds of signs that are allowed, is
The identification sign.
And what we're seeing here, of course, is a gray area, right? Pretty long opinion. Do you make sense out of it?
That's part of the story.
Yeah, well, you know, that's a start. What do we take away from this? What, you know, to think most prosaically, what do you put in your outline from this?
It seemed like, I guess it kind of goes back to that non-commercial, right? We talked about that where it's non-commercial display. And whether or not that violates the First Amendment rights, right?
Yeah, what we get, this is on page 571 under Roman or capital A. We get a nice recitation, more or less, these standards right here. But the court does us a great favor by reordering it a little bit and giving us more or less a differential analysis, like we did for the Tippy's subject. And I guess, you know, you say, well, this court's so much better than the previous court. But, you know, they've had 30 years to work. The intermediate case is 1981. This is 2007. So the split here between these two standards is not, they don't articulate it as a split between commercial and non-commercial. How do they make the difference? The distinguishing criterion, or how do they articulate that distinguishing criterion between these two different sets of standards?
We talked a lot about this other case that
Yep. You have your book with you? Yeah, you have your book with you there? Can you look on and see? Okay. Why don't you just read that paragraph? Because that, they pretty much lay it out for us here. It's page 571, under capital A, Melrose's First Amendment.
Melrose First Amendment and NAPA, we articulated the framework for the community whether the statute is contemplated or contemplated.
See, whenever you're reading this stuff, that's the goal right there. When you see that kind of introduction, you go, okay, pay attention here. Get your underlining out here because this is what you're going to want to put into your outline. Okay, so what is that framework?
So, yeah, framework, whether it's content-based or content neutral.
Right, so that's our first, we're going to create our differential analysis, that's our first box. We say content neutral is the question. If, let's see, where do they go next? Is the content neutral, or content, maybe content based? If the answer is no, it's not content neutral, it's content based, then what?
It's content-based, the government must show that the regulation is necessary to serve the compelling state interest, and that it is merely drawn to achieve their end.
So 3 standards, more or less, what we've got over here. Excuse me. Well, it's slightly different, but we'll make some comparisons here in a second. Okay, and then it is content neutral. Reading on.
Content neutral in that it merely restricts the total quantity of speech by regulating the time, the place, and the manner of which one speaks, which is a very different test applies to that.
Okay. And they lay that out for us. Okay.
You ready to keep going with that?
Yeah, we're just going to fill out the framework here.
Under this test, the government is committed to impose reasonable restrictions on the time, place, or manner of protected speech, provided the restrictions are justified without reference to the content of the regulated speech.
Which is just kind of rephrasing, it's a little redundant here. One of the factors is that it's content neutral, but we've already determined that, but we needed a better editor. Okay, so we just rephrase that, all right?
The next would be that they are narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest.
Okay.
And the third is that they leave open, ample alternative channels for communication of the information.
So, not exactly the same as Metro Media, but pretty close. Pretty close. What is different here is it's kind of a game of adjectives. I want to point your attention to these. Three different words, one of them used twice. If you were to put these on a continuum, on a scale, with this being kind of the greatest level, the level of greatest impact, over this on the right-hand side, and this being the level of least impact. Or maybe if we were to think of it in terms of volume on an iPad, right? And on an iPod, this would be completely off. This would be full body. How would you order these three adjectives?
I find that to be tough. Well, substantial, if we go back to the substantial due process, you were saying that it just has to be almost just some evidence, right? Whether it's more or less than the other side. So
But that's not substantial due process, that's substantive due process.
substantive.
Yeah,
You have to
the
have
first,
substantial evidence that,
right, substantial evidence, right, right. What
Seems
about,
like
what about this, is it easier starting with this one?
maybe the furthest left side on that one?
To the least impact? It's actually the other way around.
Okay, the other way around.
Yeah.
Why don't you just tell me what you're thinking now?
I wanna hear it from you. I mean, I could do all the talking. It would be a
There
lot.
could be an argument for any one of those words, but
Sure, it could be, I wanted to hear where you're going with
what
it.
do you think would be perfect? How about significant as the least?
You're right. See? I don't know all the answers, but what I do have is the experience of having read a bunch of this stuff for years. And so I'm genuinely interested in how it comes across to you.
That'd be more than 0.
It would be more than 0, and this is less than 100. So good point. So we'll move those off the scale here. I don't know how far off, but these are the words. What do they mean? But this is the way that the legal community kind of orients these 3 words, and is moving in ascendancy of kind of significance. It goes, having a significant governmental interest is basically, you say it's important, okay, it's important. We think it's important. A substantial governmental interest, well, that's got to be pretty important. A compelling governmental interest basically says it's got to be really darn crucial. There got to be like limb and life at stake here. This is sometimes called, this standard here is sometimes called strict scrutiny. You might have heard that phrase used in the reporting on the Supreme Court's activities this week, reviewing ballot measure 8 from California and the Defense of Marriage Act, which are not being challenged under First Amendment arguments that be challenged under equal protection arguments in the 14th Amendment. But this is what this language is also used in that context. And so if something has to have a compelling governmental interest, it's got to be pretty darned important here. Like I said, there must be lives at stake. That's a little overly dramatic. It doesn't have to be quite that extreme, but that's the, it's got to be approaching that level of importance. If not for this regulation, people could get hurt. Is basically what a compelling governmental interest has to show. So what we get from the Melrose case is a recasting of what we got from Metro Media, and it's a merging of Central Hudson on commercial speech and non-commercial. Melrose is not making that distinction, or making it the same way. It's asking whether it's content neutral or content based, because that's not too much of a stretch, right? Because this determination here about whether speech is commercial or not commercial is what? Content based. You're making an assessment about whether certain kinds of communication is commercially oriented or not. And that's looking at the content. And so this is just a different way to address that question. That, as far as what I'm concerned about you understanding from this class, that's what I want you to know. And I think whichever formulation speaks to you, follow whichever one you think makes the most sense. I kind of like this one, but what you understand is that if the regulations are content-based, the interest that has to be shown by the government, it has to be a much stronger interest. And it has to be narrowly drawn. Whereas if it's content neutral, you want to protect it, But the interest is, doesn't have to rise to the same level, but there have to be alternative available. The rest of this decision goes on to talk about how we make this calculation here. As in a case like this, it's pretty great, right? I mean, it's, you know, we need nurses.com. Oh, what do you think that's all about? Is that the name of a building, or is that the name of a business, or is that, you know, do they want us to go to that website? I think they do. Being able to figure out the difference between the two is not important for us, at least in this way. If you go on and go to law school and take constitutional law, well, you have plenty of time to understand these things. Okay. Thank you. Case that we didn't talk about from before Supreme Court. Kilo versus New York. Remember that? Oh yeah, they didn't get to it. And I remember today. Well, maybe we'll have some extra time. We do. I'll do this. I'm up on it. So anybody been to New London, Connecticut? Nobody from the military in there? Used to be pretty substantial Navy, right? Something I can't remember, or was it Coast Guard? What's that? Yeah, but there was maybe it was Coast Guard. Pretty substantial military installation there. Got shut down. Base closing, and it was never a real hotbed of economic activity before the base closure, and then with base closure, things were looking pretty kind of dire for you, and lots of unemployment and abandoned real estate, and so that's important for understanding this case, because it's not just a matter of, you know, the government coming in and taking private property and giving it to Pfizer, although that's what they did. Pfizer being a very large international conglomerate in pharmaceuticals. But it was also a city trying to help its citizens find work, generate tax revenue that can be used to invest in schools and community facilities and infrastructure to help build an economy. And that's what the city was after. They got support from the state legislature in the form of a bill authorizing the city to reform itself into an economic development organization or corporation, semi-public, and to create an economic development plan for a portion of the town that they deemed to be hardest hit and most opportune for redevelopment, and very importantly, the power to go and exercise eminent domain, which the city already had in some circumstances, but it was just re-emphasized in this authorized legislation, to go in and take property as necessary to carry out the purposes of this economic development scheme. Along the way, the city developed a well-considered plan. What's that phrase again? A well-considered plan. Meaning that they spent a lot of time and a lot of money on consultants to come up with not just something that was drawn on the back of an envelope in a dimly lit bar, but something that was pretty substantial. And it was large. And the acreage here, I've forgotten, but it's more than 100 acres, I believe. And those of you that are familiar with the concepts of new urbanism, this was a new urbanist dream. And it was pedestrian-oriented, transit-oriented, it was mixed use, and it was moderate to high density, and there would be affordable housing included, and a promenade, And it had, this promenade, esplanade area that was along the waterfront there, and it was going to be the new center of town. It was going to be active and vibrant, and it was going to be, everything that we see or hope for City Creek Center and Salt Lake City. That's what they were trying to do here. The same kind of thing. And in addition, it had some manufacturing. But it was the same kind of idea. And they went forward with their plan, and of course, it was an older area, had been developed for at least 100 years, and it was broken up into a lot of small ownerships, which is the bane of large projects. Property acquisition and bundling of properties, especially in older areas, is a really thorny issue. It's tough. And you know the Smiths on 4th South, between 5th and 6th East? That Smiths there, if you go down 6th East from 4th South, and south on 6th East, and you go along, and the Smiths is, off to your right, and you get down close to the corner of 5th South, and there's that building that's kind of sitting out there by itself, and I don't know if it's occupied now. It's always kind of implemented, underused, and I think there was a check cashing place in there, Quicken Loans kind of money store kind of place, and I don't know what's in there now, but you might say, well, why is that? That seems like it really doesn't fit. Why is that there? It used to be a house there. And the house was owned by Nada.
Bill and Nada.
Bill and Nada lived in that house. Bill and Nada ran a diner that was right across the street where the gas station is now. That was a diner. That was Bill and Nada's diner. And after there was a sign on the front that said, "There's a little bit of Nada in everything that we serve." And after she died, people got but they had been there forever, and their house was right across the street. Well, when the grand scheme that created that Smiths was hatched, it was I believe it was all part of the same project, 2-block scheme, or more or less 2 blocks, 3 block like that. It was that whole block, plus the strip to the east, where Ace Hardware is now, and of course everybody knows where Trader Joe's is. Trader Joe's. That was all done as a single project. What used to be there? A school and single-family homes. And a lot of, one school, but a lot of homes. And so the redevelopment agency came in and started wheeling and dealing with people. And kind of like Suzette Kilo, in this case, Bill and Nada refused to stop. Nope, weren't going to do it. Not going along with it. And the city could have exercised eminent domain, decided not to. And so they built the project, tore everything down, built the project, and built this wall around Bill and Nada's house. And they lived there until they didn't live there. Until they didn't live. It wasn't right after they died, but sometime after they died, somebody, I think, finally their kids came to an agreement and decided, okay, we're not using that, and they sold it off, and that, kind of piece of, what, building that over. It functions very well, and the cafe back home. But, so that's what we're dealing here, with a holdout, actually a handful, about 8 people who were not willing to leave their homes. And they did not believe that this was the best idea, and they certainly didn't want to sacrifice their homes for this idea. And not Suzette Kilo, but one of the other plaintiffs in the case, was born in the house that she was being asked to leave, and had been the house of her parents and I think her grandparents too. So, obviously we're talking about a lot of non-monetary values here wrapped up in this real estate. And even though the government is, New London, City of New London is offering, we assume, just compensation for these properties. They think it's not constitutional because the takings clause has an implied limit in addition to just compensation. I say implied because it doesn't really say that it's a criterion, but it is. And that is, the takings clause says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And if you kind of parse that language, what you see, at least lurking in shadows, is this shadow requirement that when eminent domain is exercised, it has to be for public use. There's a counter argument to that interpretation, but this is the one that's accepted. And Suzette Kilo and her fellow plaintiffs said, you know what? This is not public use. You're going to take our property, and then you're going to hand over the real estate to private corporations, and not just lease it, give it or sell it at a probably very reduced land value to these corporations to get this project. And we don't think that satisfies the requirement of the Constitution. Well, we know the outcome here. The court said, well, actually it does. How do we understand this opinion? Well, there is a rule that's buried in here. We know that the government, if the government tries to take private property solely for the benefit of giving it to another private entity, okay, that's unconstitutional. That doesn't fly. But they can give it to another private entity as long as it serves some sort of legitimate governmental purpose and it's not arbitrary or capricious. Sound like substantive due process? It is. And the rule is on page 1024. When the legislature's purpose is legitimate, a legitimate governmental purpose, right? It is something that is within the governmental powers to regulate. Health, welfare, for example. And its means are not irrational, not arbitrary or capricious. Our cases make clear that empirical debates over the wisdom of these takings, no less than the debates over the wisdom of other kinds of economic legislation, are not to be carried out in federal courts, meaning the federal courts will affirm the government's action. And this is where having a well-considered plan pays off, right? You have a well-considered plan that is seeking economic benefits for your citizens. Legitimate governmental purpose, check. Not irrational, check. It's going to be okay. The ruling was not popular in many quarters. State legislatures across the country threatened to pass bills restricting what redevelopment agencies could do, which are fine, because what we're talking about here is the constitutional floor, the minimum below which a government may not go. But they can certainly set the bar higher if they choose to voluntarily, right? There was at least a lot of talk about doing that through legislation at the national level and at the state legislature level. A couple, for all the talk, but only a couple actually did. There was a little bit of a change in the urban redevelopment laws in Utah, but not as wholesale as you would have thought for all the rights. So we don't spend a lot of time on this because basically it's stuff you already know, and for all the froth, there's not a lot of material to work with. All right. So next week on Tuesday, because that is our next class, right? It's Tuesday. I know this. We will be talking about green buildings and generating alternative power. Basically, on that second category, it's wind farms as a source of nuisance and a source of zoning regulation. So that's Tuesday. Have a nice weekend. Enjoy the great weather.